Hi, my name is Daniel Kroop. It's a pleasure to be with everybody here this afternoon at the Convergence conference. Today we're here for, I think, the first workshop of the weekend, which is a nice shift from some of the activities we've had before. The title of this workshop is Rebuilding a Fighting Labor Movement, and how important is that? So just a little bit about the way that we're going to proceed. To my left is Marty. To my right is Botz, who is just on the plenary panel that you may have, hopefully, were a part of an hour ago. This is a very important topic. I just wanted to do a quick straw poll. How many people here have been in a union? How many people here have not been in a union? Okay, great. That's the labor guy, at least for this particular discussion. Great, so I think hopefully we can pull out a lot of those experiences as we move to the interactive section, and you'll have lots of good questions. So let's just do quick intros from you guys, and then we'll take off after the intros.
My name is Botz. I think the reason I'm here is because I worked over the years on labor issues. I was involved as an organizer and one of the co-founders of the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, which is a reform movement in the Teamsters. I worked with labor notes. I wrote their first Troublemaker's Handbook, which is an organizing manual based on interviewing hundreds of workers about their organizing experiences. I've written several books about the labor movement and social movements in Mexico and also in other countries, one of them being Indonesia, which is Southeast Asia. I think that's why I'm here. I work with studies think about it.
Hi everybody, I'm Marty. If you were here this morning, you know that I'm a nurse at Temple University Hospital in Philadelphia. I am on the executive board of my local. My union is called PASNAP, Pennsylvania Association of Staff Nurses and Allied Professionals, and we have had a relationship with AAU kind of on and off again. I'm a long-time member also of Socialist Alternative.
Would you start?
Sure, I can start.
I'm not sure. It might make more sense for mine is more general context.
Right.
You care?
No.
Okay. So I thought I would start by saying the labor movement could very possibly be extinguished in the United States by the end of Trump's term. That is, labor unions could be pretty much put out of business. It's a tremendous attack that we are under, and those of us who are in the working class, who are part of unions, who are concerned about democracy in our society, because labor unions make a tremendous contribution to democracy. This is 100 workers. And if you have 100 workers, this is how many belong to unions today. About 6 or 7%. We can include this gal here, or girl, man, whatever it is. This worker here, 6-7%. That's how many workers are in unions. In the public employees, it's 30%. But there are a very small group. This is the private sector. Sorry, this is the private sector. If we set the whole working class, we get about 10 or 11%. 6% in the private sector, 30% in the public sector, but it doesn't affect that's still 11% as a total, right? So, and right now there's a tremendous attack. The attack is taking place. The Supreme Court will deal with a case called the Janus case, which is really about trying to eliminate public employee rights, to reduce the rights to collect what are called agency shop, or sometimes the unions call it to pay for the free riders. That is, people who work in some place, but they don't want to be a member of the union, but they have to pay a fee anyway because the law requires unions to represent them. So the union says, we're required to represent them, you ought to pay a fee. The Janus case could wipe that out, and that would lead probably to a catastrophic decline in the number of union members. Some unions have been able to resist that. We also face with Trump and for the last couple of presidential administrations, we've had an increasing number of states that have gone right to work. So right to work means that you don't have to be a union member where you work. And this has largely affected the public sector, but also some for the private sector. And I think we're up to 27 to 30 states I was just looking, and I'm not, I think it's about 27, 28 states that now have right-to-work laws. It used to be, we thought of that as the South. The South is where they didn't have unions. But now it's true all over the Midwest. Also, Trump makes appointments to the Labor Board. The Labor Board deals with cases of collective bargaining representation, the National Labor Relations Board. I was fired once for union organizing in a newspaper and had to have a Labor Board case. I actually won the case right at the beginning of the Reagan era and was returned to work. But that agency can then affect people's ability to have their contracts enforced and keep their job. And he also, Trump and his administration will appoint not only the Labor Department, I should have said, not only the Labor Board, they also will deal with the Labor Department appointments, which affects the whole general policy. And then, of course, in the state legislatures, as you know, a majority of states are controlled by Republicans. In many states, they control the governors, the state legislature, and the courts. So the deck is stacked against us at the moment tremendously, and unions will become under great attack. The working class in the United States has not only got 11% organized overall, but the number of strikes has decreased dramatically. Now, why is that important? You might think, well, if we're workers, we don't want to have to go on strike. Because when you go on strike, you lose money, it disrupts your life, it's not fun. It can be a little fun. But the problem is this. It is the strike which keeps the union alive. It's the having to go on strike to mobilize workers that I say, hey, we've got to go out. You've got to come with us. This is how we're going to keep our union alive. If we go out on strike here, our union will be stronger, we'll win higher wages, you form a relationship with me because we go on strike together, I get to know the rest of you because we walk the picket line together. The union is dynamized. It is made a positive force because of being on strike. We had big strike waves in the United States. This one accompanied the huge international strike wave from about 1914, back in 1912, that actually preceded World War I. It goes on to 1923. More or less. This is a period of tremendous labor activity, big strike wave in the United States, meat packers, steel workers, and so on. In the 1930s, we have the great industrial strike wave that organizes, this is just totally made up, but these mountains are more or less right, so I don't have any exact numbers here. But we have this tremendous organizing in the 1930s of the CIO unions, auto workers, glass workers, rubber workers, steel workers, electrical workers, about 3.5 million workers are organized into the CIO, and the AFL actually organizes more workers in the same period. So we come out with a much bigger labor movement at the end of the 1930s. Biggest strike wave then to date was in 1946, right after the war. Workers have unions. They're angry about what happened during the war, that people made big war profits. They weren't able to keep up during the war. They now want to buy houses, move to the suburbs. There's a whole big thing taking place. They go on strike in 46, huge strike wave. But it's actually the end of the whole era here. And then we go into a long period of this is, we sometimes say, the 30 golden years, 39 to 1969. The 30 golden years, Piketty calls them in his book. These are the years of international economic prosperity, growth in the capitalist system. A crisis begins in 69. Employers start to push start to change labor activities. 1970-71, a huge strike wave in the United States involving truck drivers, postal workers, many other categories, telephone workers, and so on. Today, the number of strikes has been declining rapidly, and today we have very few strikes of any significance. There's only a couple strikes that have made any impact in the last few years that we really think about. The most important one, the Chicago Teachers Union strike. And that strike a few years ago, is it 2012 or 14? I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the exact date. But the Chicago Teachers Union, this is a union that a group of longtime union members, activists in the union, a couple socialist groups, Solidarity, which I'm a member, another group called the International Socialist Organization. Those socialist groups became involved with the longtime union organizers. They said, we're going to have a different kind of union. We're going to go out and make an alliance with the black community, with the Latino communities. We're going to make an alliance to fight to defend public education and to stop the closing of schools, which was, eliminating black teachers' jobs, and so on. So they really had a different kind of attitude. They built a citywide campaign that was not only the labor unions, but was really the working class of Chicago really backed the union, supported the union, and they were unable to really, it was not like a clear-cut win, but they stopped the attempt to drive teachers back in terms of their wages and conditions. So that was a very important event, but that's really kind of like it. We had the recent Verizon strike, 40,000 workers on strike. It was an inspiring event that people came out and they organized, and the union led people out to, some of them were newly organized workers, and to fight to improve their wages and defend the union there. But it was not something that really changed the game, you know. But those are the two strikes that come to mind for the last several years. If we went back to 1996, in 1996 there was a little interesting blip, which was the UPS strike. And the UPS strike, during a period in which reform leaders came to power in the union, that UPS strike really had a big impact. It was really great because they put in front of the screen all these young, you know, if you see the young UPS workers who come to your door to deliver packages, they're all beautiful, young, healthy people, you know? I mean, so they put these men and women, black, white, Latino, Asian, whatever, they put all of them on the screen saying, these are the people fighting for full-time jobs. They want full-time jobs. And that really resonated. And it was a tremendous strike. You can find an article I wrote about it online if you'd like to know more. What's happening is workers are increasing the productivity, that is, companies are increasing their productivity, but workers' wages have remained stagnant. There's almost no change in workers' wages for 30 years or so. So we're producing a lot more. Nothing is changing here. Now I want to say one word about, well, what is the nature of these labor unions? Well, one of the problems is, I'm a defender of the labor unions and the labor movement. I've walked lots of picket lines. I support a union that's on strike. There's very few strikes I wouldn't support. But the union is not like, and especially I gather many of you kind of coming out of the Bernie campaign, coming out of that kind of politics, you haven't been members of unions, some of you, you're not very familiar with this. But unions often, they have local unions down here. You have, after the local, you'll have some middle level, I'll just put mid, whatever it is, some regional organization. Then you have what's called the international union. This international union might be part of the AFL, or it might be the AFL-CIO, that is, or it might be part of something called Change to Win, which is a different federation that split out of the AFL, saying it was going to change the organizing. Down here are the worker members of this. One of the things with labor unions is that we have a group of people, usually at the international level, sometimes in big cities, in the great big local unions, who are labor union officials who sort of become a social caste, I would say. That is, when Gerald McEntee retired a few years ago, African-American man became head of this public employees union. He was making $1 million a year. We have people in the Teamsters union make $500,000 a year. For many decades, that was very common. So you have people who have enormous salaries, drive fancy cars, don't ever get their hands dirty, really become supervisors of other people, managers of other people. And this social caste develops an ideology. The ideology is, we know what's best for the workers. And so very often, workers in the union fight a real fight. The workers want to go after the boss. Here's the boss up here, this big corporation, and they want to go after the boss. But to fight the boss, they often run into resistance here. We can't, we won't, and so on. I don't want to say that workers are chomping on the bit to go on strike or to fight, but on the other hand, should they want to go into motion, there's a lot of resistance, and this creates a problem. So I think one of the things I have often advocated, and I'm associated with a group of people, if you want to read some people who are smarter than me about this, some of them, Kim Moody has written a lot of books about the labor movement, and I would recommend reading Kim's book if you want to learn something about modern American labor movement. He has several books. A new one just came out. He writes like I don't know how he does it. He writes a lot of books. But the thing that we have advocated is what we call a rank and file movement. The rank and file is a term that comes from the military, because when soldiers line up, they line up by ranks and by files. Files run this way, ranks run this way, and all the soldiers are in front of you. So the rank and file movement is those people who are not the officers, right? They're not the people up here in the international union. They're not the people necessarily in the big locals who are the big leaders. They're the grassroots people. Rank and file is the labor union word for grassroots. So what we have advocated for many years is that we must go and we must build in the labor unions rank and file movements that fight to put forward demands against the employer that say we have to democratize these unions and bring them into the hands of the workers so that they can become instruments of struggle, so they can become class struggle unions that fight for the working class. And also one of the problems is that these unions are divided by trades, by crafts. We heard this word trade union used a lot, craft unions, or even by industries. There's a lot of kind of petty patriotism among these unions, and they try to defend their turf. Now, I have not said a word here about what is the big problem, which is here, which is the new organization of these workers. We need a big campaign to organize the unorganized in the United States. And it's a very complicated question. The biggest workplaces today in the United States are big hospital complexes and universities. Every city has a small town in Springfield, I don't know Springfield, but you got a hospital complex and you got a university. Those will be the two biggest employers. In Cincinnati, Ohio, where I used to live, each has 15,000 workers. This is the bastion of the proletariat right up here next to me, these nurses who are here. Those of you who are teachers, that's a big section of the working class. We have half a dozen teachers in here, that's really great. So those are big sections. But we also have these people called the precariat. And I'll end with this. The precariat is a word for people who have precarious employment. We use this word, we used to say proletariat for meaning wage earners. The precariat is people who have part-time, temporary, seasonal employment. Often, brief jobs, brief periods of time, multiple jobs. You've got 3 jobs, you're one of those. So this kind of person, that kind of person who's in that precariat, hard to figure out, well, how do we find them? How do we locate them? What is their real job? How are we going to bring them into the union? Those are the challenges for today.
Thank you, Dan. That was a tremendous introduction. I think that was wonderful. So I'm going to pass it over to Marty and let her take our role.
So thanks, Dan, for setting me up here. So I'm actually going to kind of scrap what I was going to say and just go from there, if that's okay with all y'all. Because the situation is fairly dire for those of us in the labor union movement. And I'm going to talk about working class, and just as a matter of housekeeping, when I say working class, I mean anyone who has to work for someone else in order to keep a roof over their head and food on the table, right? It's unconnected to membership in a union, income level, legal status, etc. Like, if you need to sell your labor in the market, you are part of the working class in the definition and in the way that I'm going to talk about it. And so why do those of us on the left talk so much about unions when only this many people are still in them, right? And because we're a working class movement, where these are the organizations of the working class. Our strength comes from not only our numbers, but our ability to shut shit down, right? In those strike waves. That's when we have the boss where we want them. When we rely in any of our movements on those strengths of the working class, our numbers and our ability to stop the flow of money to the boss, that's when we are powerful, that's when we get things done, and that's when we learn the lessons that we, as those on the left, want working class people to learn, right? To know in a new and different way, in a way that's on the top of their heads, right? We all know these things, that, our lives are getting worse and we're getting the fuzzy end of the lollipop, but naming the enemy, identifying the enemy clearly, this is where we have problems sometimes, right? And there's nothing like being on strike that sort of lifts the fog of who the enemy is, and what the problem is, and who significantly the enemy is not, right? I have friends of mine, members of Socialist Alternative in Minneapolis, who were on the board of the nurses at the Alina hospital system that were recently on strike. And they, after being on strike for a couple of weeks, and these are like white suburban soccer moms out on the picket line, they were very, very easily able to get those nurses door knocking for $15 an hour. They were those nurses also went with them to Black Lives Matter demonstrations because it was so clear to them in that cage match with the boss, where it's clear that your livelihood is on the line. Like the stakes are clear and the enemy becomes clear, and who the enemy is not becomes clear, more clear. And so even though the situation is dire, the American working class has shown its ability to produce explosive, fearless, combative movement. Because this line it's not a nice linear, growth in a labor movement, right? There's peaks and there's valleys. And people fought and fought and fought again, right? And we need them to fight again, and we need one of those peaks that just like goes off the chart this time, And so the question becomes then, where do we see any sort of little glimpses of light in that fight? Now, when sort of the old rules apply, and there are situations when the kind of old rules apply, there's a group of Teamsters, cement truck drivers in Seattle just recently have been working without a contract, and they struck the biggest construction company in Seattle for a week. They threatened to strike another construction company, and they settled the contract. These workers were already in a union. They had they're skilled workers, and they have, you need a particular license, but they're not that easy to replace. And Seattle has 74 major construction projects going right now. They needed them, and they delivered something that literally turns to stone if you don't pay attention to it, right? If you leave it be, the cement's ruined and the truck is ruined, right? So when the old rules apply, when there's tightness in the labor market, when there's skilled labor, they're already in the union, they have a long union tradition, and they know how to be on strike. They can win with that old form of strike. I am a nurse. I was on strike for 28 days in 2010. My union isn't one of these that was born in the period of the CIO. We didn't win the right to collective bargaining until upswing in the women's movement in the 70s. That's when we won the right to organize. Our unions don't have those long traditions of sort of taking people's knees out or anything, if they cross the picket line. Not that we don't have our ways, but girl fight is a little different. And our union, it was really necessary that my union was absolutely democratic, that every single one of those nurses, technicals, and professionals had made their own calculus in their mind that going on strike was necessary in order for us to do our jobs, which is a little bit different than cement truck drivers. In that democracy was so absolutely necessary. And that's one thing also that Dan was bringing up. Everyone had to decide. They couldn't be told what to do, is what I'm saying. They had to make that decision for themselves. And I see that this is a connection that nurses and teachers have. We have sort of the crisis of capitalism, in our face on a daily basis. Being poor is really, really bad for your health. Being poor is really, really bad for your education. And you just see the crisis of capitalism on a daily basis, right? And we fight always for patient care. We are advocates for patient care, and changing the way that bureaucracy or the upper leadership of the union sees what their job is. That's what Dan was talking about in the rank and file movement, that the job of that leadership and that union isn't just wages and benefits, or it's membership, right? That doesn't work for teachers and nurses so well, you know? We see that our job as a union is much, much broader, and that our job goes beyond the walls of the hospital, beyond the walls of the school, and that takes us as, I don't know why any nurses aren't socialists, like, because it's all there in front of you, you know, that we need to follow our patients out, we need those things, all the things in society that they need for a healthy life. And I'm sorry, I sort of got off the track there. But the other reason that we, as socialists, as radicals, as communists, as anarchists, syndicalists, whatever you call yourselves, we need to be part of this movement because it's only ever been strong when we were part of it. That what we bring to this movement is the idea that there is another way of organizing society, and we are not framed in by what's acceptable to the boss and what's acceptable to capital. And so every time, the radicals are on this side, the red baiting's on that side, the radicals are on this side, the anti-communism is on this side, right? That it's been a very clever cocktail of anti-communism and racism that's kept the union movement sort of in check in this country. And we need to be consciously overcoming both those things in our movement. Not that workers care if you're a red when you're getting them, when you're on the upswing, it's on the downswing, right? That red beating finds its roots. But we are the only one. We are the motivating factors in those upswings, and we need to continue to be there. And we've talked a little bit about, I guess so far, a lot about like existing unions, but we want to talk too about all those workers on the other side that aren't in the box over there. And there's, by any measure, the gap between what people need and what the unions are providing is just, I don't know a word big enough to describe it, right? It's huge right now. And how do the existing organizations approach unorganized workers, whether they're in the precariat or they're in a different, or they're in a sort of, more traditional setting. The UAW, the auto workers, just got sort of handed their, I don't know what you want to call it. They just lost big in the South, in Canton, Mississippi. And that clearly those workers in that Nissan plant were facing an uphill battle on a steeper incline than workers in the North would have faced. The entire sort of local political machine was against them. They faced this just tremendous anti-union onslaught. But also, the auto workers have been signing concessionary contracts for 40 years, and that was the yoke, the millstone around their neck. If you can't hand your contract to an unorganized worker and say, this is why you should join my union, you don't deserve that person's name on the card. In the reading for this, I also saw that there was a Lipton tea plant that was organized by UFCW in the last year or so. And before the UFCW came to town, those workers were working 12-hour shifts. We do that, right? That's not a huge thing. 13 days in a row. If you can't, that takes us back before this line even starts to the fights for the 8-hour day. And so one of the, just briefly, I know I'm talking too much, but one of the campaigns to organize new workers, of course, has been the Fight for 15, which obviously those workers, I don't know if anybody did any work on that campaign, but you go out there with a table and a petition and workers were coming out of McDonald's to sign those petitions when we were doing that. So the huge gap, I will stop, between what those, there's clearly a need for unions. There's now like the Pew Research poll recently that just said that a majority of people are look on unions favorably, 60% overall. The 18 to 29-year-olds, 75% see unions favorably. Even if they identify as Republicans, 18 to 29-year-olds, 55% of them are viewing unions favorably. So people are drawing the conclusion that they need to be organized. They will transform the unions that they're given, or that exist, or they will form new ones. That's what they've done on every single one of these past these upswings before, and we need to be there talking to people about how to do that. We need to be involved in those wherever you work. Talk about it. People, we even encountered people in the Fight for 15 work that said that they, the boss wanted us to work on Christmas, and we didn't go. He said, well, you went on strike? No, we just didn't go to work. Right, so there's a level still of, the union movement has been so thrown back that people outside of that movement don't understand even maybe what a union can do for them and what the purpose is. So I guess we could talk some more later about really specific things that we do, but my union is involved in organizing new nurses, techs, and professionals into new unions, and we got to do it.
All right, so we have about 40 minutes. I'm going to spend about 10 to 15 on some questions from here and then throw it open. So I just want to jump right in. I think these were both very informative, helpful, and complimentary presentations to kick us off. So sort of fascinated with this particular chart up here, chart, peaks and troughs. I'm curious, and maybe start with you, Dan, what are the key factors in the decline of the labor movement that we're seeing today? And are there lessons from the defeats, but are there also lessons from the victories that we can take away?
Well, I would say why did the labor movement go in decline? Most of us would say it went in decline starting in the late 1970s. Kim Moody, in his book, An Injury to All, which documents this decline, he says it starts when Jimmy Carter negotiated the Chrysler bailout. Here was the failing auto company. The U.S. government intervenes to save that auto company, but saves it by requiring concessions from the union. So it breaks the pattern bargaining agreement of uniformity among the workers. It lowers workers' wages. There was a similar auto bailout, in 2008, resulted in lots of plant closings and so on. And also, the UAW went for multiple tiers. So workers come in who are paid different wages, different benefits, etc. Nothing divides, it's like if you have a family and you're giving one kid in the family more than the other, you will definitely, you will have a fight at dinner. So it's the same thing. If the boss comes, the union comes to the workers and says, these workers are going to get paid $35 an hour, you're going to get $15 an hour, and you're coming in at $12 an hour. Well, that union is going to be deeply divided, full of resentment, anger, and a great motivation for the boss to get rid of all those people paid $35 an hour. Let's get them the hell out of here and keep the cheap ones. So politics was, Ronald Reagan became president. He fired 13,000 PATCO workers, professional air traffic controllers, replaced them with military controllers for a while, destroyed the only union that has supported him, ironically. But destroyed that labor union. So part of this is politics. Part of it is that on a world scale, capitalists decided that they had to reorganize because of what was happening to their profits and their control over industry. So as their profits went into decline, they decided we have to get rid of the social democratic political structure that had a lot of, because really workers get usually two wages. A wage from your boss and a social wage. The social wage is Social Security, unemployment, health care, and so on. So the employers went after both of those. So it was partly political, based on political decisions of the government, partly employers, but those two things are coordinated. They wanted to say, we're done with the golden years model of social pacts between capital and labor. Capital said, this is the agreement we've had with you since the 1930s. We're done with that agreement. That's the end of that.
Marty, we heard a little bit about factors in the decline. Maybe you could touch more, feel free to pick up that thread as well if you have sort of differences, but also lessons from victories and defeats that the labor movement should be thinking about in this period.
So not to disagree, but just to pick up the thread, what Dan was saying is the bosses had, during that period of capitalist upswing when they were making money so fast, it was easier for them to give a few crumbs off the table to the unions than to fight about it. And when the money stops coming in quite so fast, then it gets to be a fight, right? And the unions have the choice then of fighting or not, right? And we want them to take the choice of fighting. But you have to have, I think that's, again, where the left is so important in the union movement, because we're not accepting what's acceptable to the boss and to capital. That we fight unapologetically on the side of the working class. And what the working class needs, whether that's, like I said, acceptable to the boss or not. And we need to be bold, right? No one was really sticking their neck out for 10-10. We didn't see people going on strike for 10-10. We didn't see people going, risking arrest for 10-10. We saw them sticking their necks out and making the sacrifices for a bold demand for $15 an hour. And so that same lesson from the UAW loss in Mississippi, that if you don't have something to offer that's worth the fight, people aren't going to fight. You know, people want to fight. They know they need to fight, and the unions need to be showing that they can win, first of all, that the fight's going to be worth it, that the fight is winnable, like Gar was talking about from the very beginning today, and that we can win it, and it's worth it, because what we're going to fight for is going to be such a transformative for your everyday, you know, keeping the roof over your head and the food on your table.
Thanks, Marty. You may have noticed that Marty and I are wearing the same exact shirt, actually, which is a bit of a good. No, I'm teasing, actually. I think it's interesting, and my next question is actually about two of the unions that are on this shirt, the CWA and the MNA, which is the Minnesota Nurses Association, CWA, the Communications Workers of America. In addition, if we think about the ATU, the Amalgamated Transit Union, right? These are three substantial unions nationwide that endorse Bernie Sanders. And my question is, what are sort of the prospects that you see for perhaps this group of pro-Bernie unions who seem to get it, right? Roseanne DeMora of NNU seems to get it about, you know, talking about taxing Wall Street, talking about taking the fight for Medicare for all the way, right? There seem to be signs of life in at least these three unions. What are the prospects for those pro-Bernie unions to come together and really lay a new foundation for rebuilding a fighting labor movement? And if there are prospects, what are the strategies and tactics they should adopt? Yeah, if you'd like to start this time.
Sure. What are the strategies and tactics they can adopt in order to that? So I think it's no mistake that not only are these the unions that endorse Bernie, but they're supporting Ginger. Those same unions also supported, to a certain extent, Shama's campaign in Seattle. And they're the unions that have been on strike and have been fighting for their membership, and they've been confronted with the problems with that, like, traditional strike of the cement truck workers that I was talking about, that doesn't work for everybody, right? So they've come to the conclusion that there is a political aspect to the problems that they face,
in order to do their job well as unions, they need to transform the political terrain that they're fighting in. So to transform, I mean, anybody you know, send them to nursing school, get a job. Seriously, the Minneapolis Teamsters in 1934 had been sending anyone that they met in their political work to go and work in one of these trucking companies, so that when it came to it, when the fight came, they were there and they were ready, and there was trained socialists in that local, right? And we need to do that again. We need to, everyone's calling them a socialist, themselves a socialist, the young people, 18 to 29, excellent. Go and get these jobs, right? It's where jobs are. Like Dan was saying, the university hospitals are some of the biggest employers in the cities that we're in. Absolutely, not like turn to the factories, but if you don't know what you're going to do, get a job in a hospital, get active in your union and be there, because it's coming, one of these big fights. The only question isn't whether the fight's coming, the question is whether we're going to win or not, right? And in order to win, we have to be there as radicals, as socialists, as whatever we call ourselves. Okay.
I don't want you to misunderstand me. I am a person who is very optimistic about movements. I'm always the first person that I know to run out and throw myself into the Black Lives Matter march, or go out and join Occupy, etc. But I think you have to be optimistic in your vision, but you have to be realistic in the assessment. Trump very cleverly began his administration by dividing the labor unions. He brought in the building trades, the most conservative section of the unions, many of them with a long history of racism and the exclusion of people of color and women from the unions. Some of them have moderated that or improved that. But these were craft unions that were exclusively male domains for many years. And he brought them in. And he brought in the mine workers union, mine workers who were feeling under the gun, feeling that their industry was going down. Then Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, felt that he could not act decisively. So one section of the unions went over to Trump right at the beginning, the building trades, at least at the beginning. We'll see what happens to them. And then Trumka of the AFL-CIO was sort of neutralized by that fact, and by the fact that he comes out of the mine workers union and Trump is speaking to his industry. Then thirdly, we had a small group of unions who organized, mobilized, sometimes international unions, sometimes local unions, and these unions that wanted to endorse Bernie. Now those unions are none of them the big dogs of the labor movement. They are the small dogs. Some of them are beautiful dogs, but but they are not the big fighting animals of our working class. And so that's one thing to be aware of. And their motives and where they're at are different. That is, the California Nurses Association has been an aggressive union. It has grown, sometimes shrunk, sometimes but grown. But it's dynamic, it's aggressive, it feels optimistic, and so on. The American Postal Workers Union was a union feeling very on the defensive, driven back by the turn to Google Mail, driven back by the way the government deals with mail, supplementing mail at costs, and so on. And so they were a union on the defensive. So I feel that that group of unions itself was very mixed motives. I don't feel it's very representative of the working class as a whole. And so to be realistic, I think that nothing will drive these unions except a big upsurge. And where that big upsurge, you don't know where it's going to start. Can I tell one little anecdote? I'm on time. I was in France and I visited the city of Lyon. Because why does an upsurge start? Why do workers go into motion? Workers in Lyon were people who wove textiles. And once the French government decided to raise the taxes, and they were going to raise the taxes on wine. But to make the wine bottle look like we're still getting as much wine for as much money, they put a big chunk of glass in the bottle. If you ever see that bottle, it's called the Pot de Lyon. It's the Lyon wine bottle. And the workers started getting this wine bottle with less wine in it because of the way the taxes had changed. And the big strike started. Party became part of a national revolution in France. So That is, people become angered when they feel that their rights are being violated, that they're being stepped on, that there's an indignity that they feel personally, and that can ignite a latent movement. I think some of you feel, I've talked to some of you in Socialist Action, I think you feel it more, I'm sorry, Socialist Alternative, forgive me, too many initials, too many similar initials. The people in Socialist Alternative feel more strongly than I do that there's this chemical change, that there's the electricity out there, that maybe there'll be something to detonate that spark. I think it might come, but you don't know what it's going to be, when it's going to be, how it's going to happen. I think we all agree on that. But we hope it's coming, and we hope we'll have our shit together by then.
Let's get it ready
Thank you,
anyway.
Serena.
Thanks for allowing me
Let's
to
do a quick round of applause and we're going to open it up for all to participate. So I think I see some hands already. So I think the way that I would like to do this is take questions in groups of 3 and then throw it back to the panel to sort of digest them, not necessarily directly, but to address some of the points, and then we can throw it back open again. And feel free as well to, if you have a short comment of about a minute, as that's okay too, and we want those things. So I'm going to be quiet now so we can get some more of these folks in. So let's start. I saw this woman first, and we'll work down this way. And your name as well when you start your comment would be great.
My name is Michelle Lager.
You touched base briefly on the right to work states, and I wanted to kind of address that a little bit more, but in conjunction with the forced signatures that quite a few people have to do regarding arbitration clauses in order just to work. And I may not be saying this quite correctly, but quite a few states have, in order for you to work within that company, and they're usually places like Yum Industries, like the Pizza Huts and et cetera, and they force the workers to sign, or they don't force them, so you don't have to sign it, but if you don't sign it, you can't work here. Right. To sign an agreement that says, should I have a dispute with you, I cannot be a part of a class action. I pretty much can't sue you. So you can treat me however you want, you can fire me when you want because it's a right to work state, and I have no rights. But if you want to work here, I'll pay you $7.25 an hour. Do you have any thoughts for how we can move forward with these forced signatures, even though they say they're not forced, and in conjunction with the right to work states?
Okay, well, I'll start by saying that I had been in 1199 and then moved over to Lenox Hill back in the 80s, where we actually created our own in-house nursing union and walked this picket line in the freezing cold for a few days, and they caved to us. Having watched that happen and watching the economy tank, what I see is one of the reasons that our unions are crumbling. I come from that age of the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where we watched a lot of corruption from above that hurt our unions from below, and was allowed the corporations to come in and say, see, they're just not doing anything for you anyway, they're harming you, and that was exposed. And now we live in an economy where there are more workers than there are jobs. It's being kept that way purposefully so that the corporations can say, hey, well, take it or leave it. Right. How do we take that fear out of people to have them organized? Because when we started as nurses, it was a big argument that we're professionals don't do that, teachers, we're professionals, we don't do that. And when you look to Europe and you look to places like England, all the professionals have that power and strength by being one voice together in things like the National Health Service. So I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. How do we overcome that hurdle in a time of such a sketchy economy to give people that strength and power? When that happened in the 30s, unions came in with money. They actually said, we'll give you some money while you walk that picket line. I don't know if we have that ability now, and so where do you see that going, that we can get unions back across the board for every working group?
This gentleman.
I want to follow up on what you said. In one of those peaks, the early 1970s, the AFL union in the school district in which I taught, under the leadership of myself and another senior fellow, went on strike. And it was at that time the longest strike in Pennsylvania history. It was the first strike in our school district's history. We were given, when I came to work, we were given one sheet of paper not a contract, not anything, one sheet of paper, and that was the pay scale. That was it. That was the only thing that we had to hold on to. The thing that we found in organizing the union in that district, in getting the people involved, because teachers are, by nature, a very conservative group of people. Very conservative. They're not radicals. We were in a position where we needed to radicalize them in order to take them out on strike. So my question is, how do you get beyond the fear? How do you get beyond the fear with a constituency that is basically conservative and doesn't want to rock the boat? And then, a second follow-up question, how do you deal with media? I learned my lesson. One of the big radio stations in that city called me at 4:30 in the morning and at home and wanted an interview, which I stupidly gave. I was amazed listening to that recording later on in the day when all of the other people in the strike were just cursing me out, because the radio station had edited very carefully what I said to make it into something I did not say. And so how do you get beyond all of these things in order to have a viable local union and working our way on up to have a national union structure that really is powerful again?
All right, thank you. These are interrelated, so I think we'll have some good responses. Would one of you like to start?
I'll start this one if you like. I think that the only way to do it is by winning small victories, is my feeling. That is, when people feel, when they can see and say, oh, they did it, then they feel maybe we can do it. So it's winning that one first victory. Now, where you can get that, sometimes you get that because you have a business that's making money and they can make the concession to recognize the union at that time, or maybe you have a local politician who's going to be elected next year. He doesn't want to tangle with anybody. He's willing to make the concession to those public employees. So you can get lucky, and you have a bunch of workers who become convinced they have to fight, and they're prepared to go tooth and nail and win the fight. If you win one of those victories, I'll tell you a story. I had a friend, his name is Sidney Lenz, L-E-N-S. He's also a great writer about labor and U.S. foreign policy, somebody who wrote a lot about American imperialism. And he was an organizer in the 30s, and I used to get together and hang out with him some. And one time he told me this story. He said he was downtown in Chicago, and he was walking by a retail clothing store, women's clothing. And a woman came running out and said, "Mr. Lenz," grabbed his, Mr. Lenz, "come on in. All the girls are sitting down." Now, who the hell would think that shop girls in a dress shop would think they could have a sit-down strike and win a union contract? But it had become so universal, the notion that, well, if the boss isn't treating you right, you sit down in the place and somebody will come and give you a union contract. People had learned you could not go to work, and you could put pressure on them and make them yield. Now, and they would never have been able to do that. Had it not been for the fact that the auto workers had, the rubber workers had sat down first in Akron in 36, and the auto workers in 37, and then, the steel workers went on strikes and so on. So that momentum made that possible. But I think you have to win. You have to find some place you can win one. And I guess I'll say one other thing. I think my impression is, for people like you who are teachers and nurses, that those early organizers did not try to go against the sense of professionalism altogether. You had to make a break with the notion, we're a bunch of professionals, we have a professional association, and we're not really a blue-collar labor union. But also, I think and I think you're right, sir, and I think about New York teachers, many of whom were Jewish, who were sons and daughters of people who'd come over, either been small business people or factory workers, garment workers, and their kids became teachers, and everybody was very proud of that. They were very conservative, wanted to hang on to that job. But they also come out and said, we're fighting for the dignity of your profession. You're a teacher, after all. You should have the right to have time to prepare your class. You should be able to have time to give a good class to these students. You should have time to confer with the parents. That is, there was the defense of the professional ethic. So I think maybe that's something we have to think about. I don't know. Did that match your experience?
Yes, absolutely.
Over to Marty.
Yeah, we address that question about professionalism all the time. And people will say, I didn't go to school all that time, to join a union. And, our answer is always, I didn't go to school all that time to lose my license. The union is the only thing that will protect your license. It's not going to be the hospital that does that. We need to protect our patients, and the union is the thing that we can use to protect our patients. And I agree with Dan that all those questions were sort of, were interrelated, that had to do with the low level of union organizing and the low level of political clout that unions have right now. And in reference to the, having to sign the waivers, nothing would have ever, there would be no union movement if people weren't willing to do things that were illegal at any point in time, right? So the unions were illegal. You were, in the 19th century, people were found guilty of, whatever you call it,
Conspiracy and restraint of trade.
yeah, conspiracy and not treason, but there was something else they charged.
Sedition sometimes.
Sedition, that's the word.
Usually it's conspiracy and restraint of trade. That,
Yeah.
You're organizing to stop the boss from his business.
Yeah, which they have the total right to do for some reason. Yeah, and so, but the question is, why were people in a previous period willing to do illegal things and they're not now, right? So, but we just always have to keep that in mind, that there is a need to go beyond sometimes what the boss's political parties have defined as legal in order to get what we need. And in the recent organizing drive that we had in my union in 2015, we organized 3,000 new nurses and technical professionals into my union. And those nurses were as unafraid, I was blown away by how unafraid they were, that something had changed, and they were completely bold. And there's tons of super funny and interesting anecdotes that come out of that period. But I think that it had to do with us being on strike just those 5 years previous to that, and seeing that you could win. We also get rank and file nurses who are in our existing unions to be in those organizing meetings with the new technical and professionals and the new nurses who are trying to organize their union. So when they say, oh, we're facing this, blah, 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 the boss is saying this, that we say, oh, this is how we deal with that, right? And the union organizers to inoculate those organizing workers that these are your rights, and this is what you can say to the boss, and if we get, and never talk to the media, right? That we had our own media during the strike, and that's something that, they're learning about next door in the social media thing, but that's super important.
The one sister with the forced signature question did get her question answered. Can I say one?
Yeah, sure.
Just one thing. Which was?
Question about fear and overcoming.
We live in
I heard
an
that.
economic restraint. People are terrified that if they were to come together to strike, it's useless because they're just going to be replaced by someone else because there are more workers than there are jobs, and so they're terrified to leave. There are people sitting in jobs, not just because they can get health care, because they're literally terrified that if they walk away from that job, it will be years before they'll see another job. So they are putting up with all kinds of shit. So how do we get around that? And I think having one little place win isn't enough, because in the end, we really need to unionize every worker, regardless of what they're doing in trade or profession. So right now, we're looking at a very fearful economy. People are terrified of being one step away from poverty-stricken and back in the
So we tried to answer, but she didn't like our answer. But okay.
Well, he didn't really,
I think it's not an adequate
economic
answer.
part.
I think it's not an adequate answer, but I just want to say on the forced thing, there used to be a thing in the 19th century, early 20th century called a yellow dog contract. A yellow dog contract meant that the boss hired you and you signed this piece of paper that said you'll never join a union, that you're not part of a union, never join a union. The way that was gotten over was the labor movement became strong enough to pass legislation to outlaw yellow dog contracts. So I think if you get strong enough someplace, you can force the employers not to do that. And if you get strong enough in enough places, you can overcome it legislatively if you get a big enough movement. But for the time being, I don't see, in that situation where it's a weak workforce, no unions, there's probably no response to it. People, I wouldn't know what else to say. Perhaps someone else has
Actually,
something.
the ACLU has said in many cases that they make you sign them, but they're not really binding.
They're not, they are and they're not. My son is a good example. I still have adult children living with me because neither one of them can afford to live and eat on their own right now at the wages they're being paid.
Right.
And so, just to work at something that's not going to be a career choice, but a job.
So I'd like to get one more round of questions, and then we'll bring it back to bring it in. I had this gentleman first, and if you could keep it brief. Yes, you.
Do my best.
I would appreciate that because we are 11 minutes
Everyone
away.
recognizes West Kentucky accent, okay? So, our area is primarily rural, larger towns, or maybe 50,000 people. So when you start to get into that, it's healthcare and teachers are the largest employers typically, but we also have a large number of tier 1, tier 2 automotive, meaning Japanese companies, et cetera. One of the reasons we're looking to have a job fair, actually is originally wanting to do a forum, but we're wanting to draw people in, and we're going to try to have the EDC, Economic Development Council, Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, in. And what we're trying to do is reach out and ask questions, do a little frank lunch like focus groups, and have labor on one side. We have new all-Republican government, just took over the House. It was last state house in the South that was Democrat, and they stopped the right to work laws. They stopped there. Now they're trying to eliminate overtime. And basically what we're trying to do is reach out and find out what, using both sides, but hopefully being able to slant it so that we can find out what's going to encourage you to become organized, what's going to make you afraid, as Alan Greenspan said in the early 80s, overcome this job insecurity that everyone deals with today. So, have we worked on that? Is AFL-CIO or any labor organization doing that to reach out to non-organized people to develop what's important, what will move you?
Right here.
I just have a response to what you were talking about, and I guess what you were just talking about, based on not my own experience, but I recently went to a labor and organizing workshop done by Unite here, and it was really based on really practical, hands-on skills for how to get through that fear with people on a one-to-one organizing thing. So yeah, I would just like to put out the name of that organization, Unite Here. They do, at least in my city, they do workshops to help hands-on do that training.
Unite.
And I think they're here in DC too, yeah. Unite Here, yeah. So.
Thanks. I got this gentleman over here. I'm waiting patiently.
Yeah, it's not so much a question, but just a comment. I think it's easy to say that people will automatically organize when things are tough, or people will automatically unionize or organize when things are getting better and there are rising expectations. But I think the most important thing to realize is that we don't always know what the organizing breakthrough is, but we can't be looking for shortcuts. The problem of not having a job and a lot of people waiting at the factory gate for the job is not a new one. When Ford got organized, there was a line as long as a person could see to get into that factory gate, right? So I think it's really important that we, despite the fact there's a huge reserve army of labor, and in fact there are people that are structurally unemployed, that we organize nonetheless. I think that one of the ways to get through some of the structures that we're confronted with is to go back to some very basics, to begin to confront bosses, and to not necessarily always look for union contracts and collective bargaining. I think that we have to be very, very inventive. I think Fight for 15 could move in a way of more of a general union that's willing to confront bosses when they're being the absolute worst and to extract concessions, right? And I think that that kind of worker militancy actually often gets the goods, especially in retail and especially in restaurants. Especially the smaller restaurants where a picket line can shut down the restaurant for the weekend. And for a single owner restaurant, that could be devastating.
Thanks. I'd like to get this woman in, then bring it back to the panel, and then unfortunately we're out of time.
Thank you. I'm a PhD researcher here, and my in transformative consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I find, I come to this discussion informed through a lens of psycholinguistics, which I also have a background in, and that is language and interpretations and frame and mental frame and consensus models, etc. And I've been sitting here making notes, and it's rather interesting that we're discussing a lot of things in terms that are, quote, negatively formed. And they're in terms of struggles and all real decisive and divisive words of all the way, and tactics and strategy and strikes, and all of these words create a mental frame that isn't necessarily at this point, which some of us have noted, we're standing on the brink of being able to make bridges and to make transitions. And the only words that I heard in this room so far today that could be categorized, definitively in that area are endorse and transformative and supported and a job well done and sending rather than getting. Okay? So I think the focus that we're all here concerned about in that fear derivative is about creating that bridge of literally the words. Folks, if your body is spending the energy, literally, to create the language, you are going to go and actualize it in one way or another. You'll work towards it whether you know it or not. And if you do it on purpose, it can be really transformational. And it's not manipulative. It's simply a recognition of how you are sending these words and how they will be received in other situations. The words that were in question are equally, and I'll finish, where it was socialist and conclusion. The words that were in question were rights and alternatives. There was no confidence around those words.
Thanks. So I'm going to bring it back to Dan. Marty, you'll have 2 minutes, and then that's this section. So who would like to start? You started the last round. You want to start this round, Marty?
Sure. Yes.
There's a lot in there,
Yeah.
isn't there?
There is.
There's a reason why there's only 11% of the country organized right now. It has to do with fear, it has to do with these challenges in a number of ways, but I think one of the objectives of this workshop is to come out feeling positive about the incursions, be them small or innovative, be them step by step, workplace by workplace, that we can take. So anything to pull some of that together, I think, would be a nice way to end.
Right, and all of us are involved in movements, in campaigns back in the cities, from whether we're here or from another area, and there's not one of those campaigns or movements that wouldn't be advanced by a whole nother level, by an active, engaged, winning, victorious, activist labor movement, right? And so that's why we're here and talking about how to do what we can do to make that happen. And part of the question is political, of having, in my opinion, like people who have a radical, whether you call yourself a socialist or communist, whatever you call yourself, to have that political perspective and to be able to talk to people about what is happening in their lives. We try to talk to workers one-on-one to overcome those fears. And I have to say, I hear what you're saying, but I was also in rooms of hundreds of nurses who were ready to take their bosses down because they wanted to protect their patients. They were able to overcome that fear because the they needed to be able to take care of their patients, and what the boss was giving them wasn't cutting it, wasn't doing it, you know, and that brought them beyond their fear. And my union does do things to bring in unorganized nurses. We have a continuing education requirement, and so we offer continuing education courses on topics that, you know, nurses would be interested in. They come in, they get their CEUs, and they also, you know, make a connection with the union.
Thanks, Marty. Go ahead.
Well, I think because we so unsatisfactorily answered your question, I want to come back. I think that part of this is, I think, that what Marty alluded to. That is, in my Troublemaker's Handbook, the first thing I say about union organizing is you sit down with someone and you ask them, how are you feeling about things? You know, what's going on? How, you know, and you try to learn what people's fears are, and you try to you try to protect them. You know, you don't necessarily meet them in the workplace. You meet them off the workplace. You find out what they feel confident about. If they seem nervous, you say, we'll talk later. You know, that is, one has to be sort of psychologically as an organizer in tune with the person. I think there's also programmatic things. That is, we on the left have historically said, we've had demands that go, I remember back in the 70s, people raising the idea of 30 for 40, 30 hours a week for 40 hours pay, and say, if we have massive unemployment, you employed people, you know, more, if you employ people for few hours and hire more people, you'll be able to do that. If you say to workers, you know, one of the reasons people are anxious is some of their other costs. If we fight for child care, a lot of workers, that makes a big difference in their life if we could force the employer or the government to provide child care, which should be a basic thing that a society provides. So I say that. But I also want to make, you know, I've traveled to other countries to interview and talk with workers. And I was in a Pepsi plant. These were male workers in a Pepsi plant. The guy took me around and pointed to former union presidents. This one was assassinated 10 years ago. This one was assassinated 8 years ago, et cetera. And he had just been elected the union president. And he stood there with tears in his eyes saying, I feel I have to do this. And I was in Indonesia where workers, women workers, I went to a safe house provided by, interestingly, by the Catholic Church, but for Muslim workers. And Muslim women sat there and talked to me about why they felt they should organize in a plant that was controlled also by a plant that was very repressive and where the police would come in and brutalize people as well as just the employer. So I think these questions are all sort of relative about fear. And, but I appreciate it's a very serious question. And part of it we have to deal with personally, part of it sort of programmatically, and part of it we have to deal with by winning. So.
I want everybody to give a round of applause. Dan Botz and Marty Harris.